A vast canvas hangs in a dim room in Amsterdam. At first, it seems almost swallowed by darkness. Then the light finds it. A captain's red sash, a pale young girl glowing like a memory, faces emerging as if from mist. The painting is alive with motion, yet wrapped in shadow. This is the Night Watch. And standing before it, one does not simply see soldiers. One feels breath, tension, the weight of unseen stories. But light, here, is not merely illumination. It is revelation. It touches one face gently, abandons another, hides more than it shows. It behaves like memory, like grief, like time itself. What kind of mind paints like this? What kind of life learns that darkness is not the enemy of light, but its partner? Behind this monumental canvas stood a man who knew brilliance and loss in equal measure. A man celebrated in youth, burdened in middle age, and nearly forgotten at death. He painted triumph, but lived through debt. He captured human dignity while watching those he loved slip away one by one. Tonight, we step quietly into the Dutch Golden Age, into narrow canals, candlelit rooms, and the silent space between light and shadow. We walk beside Rembrandt van Rijn, not as legend, but as a man learning to see the human soul. If you enjoy calm, immersive journeys into the lives behind history's greatest minds, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Your presence here helps these stories continue. Now, let us begin in a small town called Leiden, where a miller's son first learned to watch the light. Chapter 1. A Boy Who Watched the Light. Rembrandt van Rijn was born in 1606 in the Dutch city of Leiden, a place of brick houses, narrow waterways, and wide northern skies. It was not a royal city, nor a poor one. Leiden was industrious, scholarly, and Protestant, a town shaped by trade, learning, and quiet discipline. His father, Harmen Gerritzoon, owned a windmill on the banks of the Rhine. His mother, Nieltken Willemstra, came from a baker's family. They were not aristocrats, but they were stable, respectable, and practical. People who understood work, routine, and the steady turning of seasons. The windmill stood where land, water, and sky met in long, horizontal lines. The Dutch landscape did not overwhelm with mountains or ruins. It offered subtler dramas, cloud banks rolling low, sudden breaks of sunlight across flat fields, reflections trembling on river surfaces. Light here was never constant. It drifted, softened, vanished, returned. A child growing up under such skies learned, perhaps without knowing, that illumination is always temporary, and therefore precious. Rembrandt was the 9th child. In a large household, attention is rarely constant. One learns to observe before speaking, to study faces for mood, to read emotion in silence. Nothing in the records describes a sickly or tragic childhood. Yet something in his later work suggests a boy deeply attentive to the human presence, to wrinkles, weariness, thoughtfulness. While other children might have chased noise and movement, he seems to have been drawn to stillness. The way an elderly neighbor's eyes rested after a long day, the heaviness in a laborer's posture, the quiet concentration of his mother reading scripture. His parents did something unusual for an artisan family. They sent him to the Latin school, preparing him for university. Education meant language, scripture, rhetoric, disciplines that trained the mind to consider moral weight and human complexity. Even if he did not remain long in academic life, the exposure mattered. Stories from the Bible were not merely tales. They were dramas of doubt, betrayal, endurance, forgiveness. These themes would later echo in faces he painted, not as symbols, but as living people. Inside the family home, light would have entered through small windows, falling sharply across wooden tables, loaves of bread, hands at work. Candlelight in the evenings carved features into planes of gold and shadow. Such scenes leave impressions deeper than memory. They shape perception itself. For some, darkness hides. For Rembrandt, darkness revealed contour, presence, vulnerability. Nothing yet marked him as famous. No commissions, no studios, no patrons. Only a boy in a river town, watching how daylight faded from a face, how expression lingered after words ended. Before he ever held a brush with ambition, he had already begun his life's work, learning how to see. Chapter 2. When the world became a stage of light. Leiden was a city of learning, and for a brief moment, Rembrandt's path seemed destined for scholarship rather than paint. After the Latin school, he enrolled at the University of Leiden, an unusual step for a future artist. The university did not train painters, but it cultivated habits that would never leave him. Careful observation, attention to language, and an understanding that human stories carry moral and emotional gravity. Even if his academic career was short, the exposure placed him in a world where ideas mattered as much as appearances. Yet the pull of images proved stronger than lectures. Around his mid-teens, Rembrandt entered the workshop of Jacob van Swanenburg, a Leiden painter known for architectural scenes and depictions of hellfire. Dramatic spaces filled with light effects. In that studio, art ceased to be decoration and became construction. A painting could be built like a stage set. Figures did not simply exist. They occupied space shaped by illumination. Fire glowed. Shadows deepened. Light directed the eye like a silent narrator. Here, Rembrandt learned craft, preparing panels, grinding pigments, controlling line. But more importantly, he absorbed a principle that would define him. Light is not passive. It acts. It reveals intention, emotion, and meaning. His education did not end in Leiden. Around 1624, he traveled to Amsterdam to study under Peter Lastman, a history painter who specialized in dramatic, biblical, and mythological scenes. Amsterdam was different from Leiden. It was louder, wealthier, crowded with merchants, sailors, languages from distant ports. Trade had made the Dutch Republic prosperous, and prosperity demanded images, portraits, narratives, proof of status. Art here was business, but also spectacle. Lastman taught narrative clarity. A single frozen moment must imply what came before and what will follow. Gesture mattered. Expression mattered. But above all, contrast mattered. Bright figures emerging from dark surroundings, action crystallized in a beam of light. Through Lastman, Rembrandt encountered the legacy of Caravaggio and Italian chiaroscuro, filtered through Dutch sensibility. Darkness was no longer empty space. It was atmosphere, tension, the unknown pressing against the visible. Some students imitate. Rembrandt absorbed and transformed. He became fascinated less with heroic beauty than with human reaction. The hesitation before action, the flicker of doubt, the weight of realization in a face. Art, he began to understand, was not merely representation. It was recreation, the rebuilding of reality according to inner vision. By the time he left Lastman's studio, the world no longer appeared evenly lit. It appeared theatrical. Every face held a hidden drama. Every shadow concealed possibility. The young student from Leiden had discovered something decisive. Through paint, light could think. Chapter 3. The Birth of a Signature. When Rembrandt returned to Leiden in the mid-1620s, he did not return as a master. He returned as a young man with training, ambition, and no guarantee of success. Leiden was respectable, but it was not Amsterdam. Commissions were fewer, patrons were cautious. Reputation had to be built slowly, face by face. He established a small workshop and began collaborating with another rising talent, Jan Lievens. The two young painters worked in close proximity, sometimes so closely in style that later historians would struggle to distinguish their early works. Competition sharpened them both. Each wanted to be noticed. Each sought distinction. Rembrandt's earliest independent works were modest in scale, but bold in intention. Biblical scenes, scholars in contemplation, figures caught in intense psychological moments. Unlike many contemporaries who smoothed features into polite elegance, he exaggerated expression. Brows furrowed deeply, mouths parted in surprise, eyes widened with revelation or fear. He was less interested in beauty than in interior movement, the instant when thought becomes visible. Yet the market did not always reward such intensity. Dutch buyers often preferred refined portraiture, calm dignity, tidy clothing, flattering light. Rembrandt offered something less comfortable. His shadows were heavy, his faces unidealized, age lines remained, skin showed texture. He allowed imperfection to exist openly. There were likely frustrations. Few young artists escape them. Commissions came, but not in abundance. Recognition flickered rather than burned steadily. To survive, he had to navigate the tension every serious artist encounters. How to earn a living without surrendering vision. It was during these Leiden years that he began experimenting with self-portraits, not grand statements, but studies. He painted himself laughing, frowning, startled, pensive. He used his own face as laboratory material. By exaggerating expression in the mirror, he trained his understanding of musculature and emotion. But something deeper was occurring. He was confronting himself as subject. In these small panels, lit dramatically from one side, a pattern emerged. Light carved his features into relief. Shadow swallowed half his identity. It was not merely technique, it was philosophy forming. A human being, he seemed to suggest, is never fully visible. There is always concealment, ambiguity, interiority. Financial necessity may have pushed him forward, but artistic stubbornness defined him. Instead of adjusting fully to market taste, he leaned further into contrast.
darker backgrounds, more focused illumination, emotional climax rather than decorative calm. Gradually, his name began circulating beyond Leiden. Patrons in Amsterdam took notice of the young painter whose figures seemed to breathe in darkness. He was not yet famous, but he was no longer invisible. The struggle had done its work.
In the friction between ambition and limitation, imitation and independence, a signature was born. Not merely a style of painting, but a way of seeing. Rembrandt had discovered that his strength lay not in pleasing the eye, but in revealing the soul. Chapter 4. The moment Amsterdam turned its head. In 1631, Rembrandt left Leiden and moved to Amsterdam, the thriving heart of the Dutch Republic. Ships arrived daily from distant coasts, warehouses overflowed with spices and textiles, and wealth flowed through merchant families eager to record their status. Portraiture was not vanity alone. It was proof of place in a new, self-made society. Opportunity lived here. Through connections, Rembrandt entered the circle of art dealer Hendrik Eulenburg, whose workshop supplied portraits to the city's elite. For the first time, the young painter stood at the center of demand. Commissions came not one by one, but in a steady stream. Yet success did not arrive because he conformed. It came because he transformed expectation. In 1632, he received an assignment that would mark a turning point. A group portrait of the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicolaes Tulp. He was still only in his mid-20s, an age when many painters were assisting in studios rather than shaping public, civic images of their own. Such paintings were typically static records, men arranged in rows, faces equally lit, status evenly displayed. Rembrandt saw something else. He turned documentation into drama. Instead of a line of faces, he created a scene. The corpse lies pale and diagonal, a stark beam of light guiding the viewer's eye. Dr. Tulp's hand demonstrates anatomy with poised precision. The gathered surgeons lean inward, each reacting differently. Curiosity, concentration, unease. Their expressions are not identical masks, they are individual responses to mortality itself. Light here performs surgery of its own. It isolates gesture, reveals texture, binds the group into shared focus. The dark background removes distraction. For the viewer, it feels less like looking at a portrait and more like witnessing an event. The painting was displayed publicly and widely admired. Rembrandt's name began circulating among those who mattered: patrons, collectors, civic leaders. He was still young, but now he was visible. Amsterdam, a city that rewarded innovation tied to skill, had taken notice. With recognition came confidence, and with confidence, expansion. Larger commissions followed, income rose. A new chapter opened, one where talent and opportunity met at full strength. For Rembrandt, this success was not simply professional. It confirmed a belief forming since his student days, that human truth, illuminated at the right moment, could command attention in any room. The city of commerce had paused, just briefly, to look into the shadowed light he offered. Chapter 5. Carving Light, Revealing Souls. With Amsterdam's attention secured, Rembrandt's work did not become safer. It became deeper. Success gave him freedom, and freedom allowed him to pursue the direction already forming within him. His style now began to crystallize into something unmistakable. Light, in his hands, was no longer a general glow. It became selective, deliberate, almost moral. faces emerged from darkness as if stepping forward from the unknown. Backgrounds dissolved into shadow, not from neglect, but from intention. He understood that what remains unseen shapes meaning as powerfully as what is revealed. His brushwork also changed. Where many Dutch portraitists prized smooth surfaces and fine polish, Rembrandt allowed texture to live. Fabric looked heavy. Skin carried weight and age. Gold embroidery caught light with tactile richness. Paint itself became substance, not just illusion. This physicality made his figures feel present, occupying real space rather than decorative surfaces. Most striking was his commitment to psychological presence. A Rembrandt portrait did not merely show a person's status, it suggested interior life. A merchant might appear thoughtful rather than triumphant. A scholar might look weary, absorbed in invisible concerns. He sought the pause between thoughts, the quiet behind expression. During these years, he continued painting himself, not out of vanity, but investigation. In self-portraits, he experimented with light angles, facial expressions, and aging. He observed how shadow could soften confidence or deepen introspection. His own face became a lifelong record of inquiry into identity. Compared with prevailing trends, his direction was unconventional. Dutch taste often leaned toward clarity, brightness, and descriptive detail. Rembrandt moved toward concentration and emotional gravity. Instead of evenly lit faces, he offered illumination with hierarchy, one eye brighter, one side receding. This asymmetry made his subjects feel alive, shifting, human. Collectors began recognizing this difference. To own a Rembrandt portrait was to possess more than likeness. It was to own an encounter. Viewers felt seen in return, as though the painted gaze contained awareness. In these Amsterdam years, his visual language matured into its essential form. Dramatic chiaroscuro, textured surfaces, emotional immediacy. Technique served empathy. Illumination served understanding. Rembrandt was no longer merely a skilled painter in a prosperous city. He had become an interpreter of human presence, carving light in order to reveal the soul beneath.
Chapter 6. Prosperity, Pride, and the Weight of Appearances. Revised. By the mid-1630s, Rembrandt's life seemed aligned with success. In 1634, he married Saskia van Eulenburg, the cousin of art dealer Hendrik Eulenburg, and a woman from a respected Frisian family. The marriage strengthened his social position and widened his network among Amsterdam's affluent circles. Portrait commissions continued, and his income allowed him to live not as a craftsman scraping by, but as a man of means. In 1639, he purchased a large house on the Breestraat, an ambitious decision. The property was expensive, filled with rooms that signaled status as much as comfort. Inside, Rembrandt assembled a remarkable collection: paintings, prints, armor, exotic textiles, sculptures, curiosities from distant lands. These objects were not merely possessions. They were tools, references, costumes for his studio, a private archive of visual knowledge. To visitors, however, the scale of the collection reflected a life lived on a larger material scale than many artists of his time. Amsterdam, though prosperous, valued moderation shaped by Protestant culture. Wealth was common, but display was often measured. Rembrandt's household stood within this environment as one that combined artistic curiosity with visible comfort. His art, too, moved along its own path. Rather than pursuing polished elegance alone,
he remained drawn to human presence, strong contrasts of light, and emotional immediacy. Beneath prosperity, practical pressures gathered quietly. Payments for the house were structured over time. Income fluctuated. Collecting required funds. The line between investment, study, and expense was not always clear. For an artist whose earnings depended on commissions rather than fixed patronage, such commitments carried uncertainty. Not unusual in the commercial art world of the Dutch Republic, but significant nonetheless. Social expectations also created subtle negotiations. Patrons generally sought likeness and dignity. Rembrandt often added psychological presence, the suggestion of thought, fatigue, or inner life. This did not represent open conflict, but it marked a difference between portrait as record and portrait as exploration. Meanwhile, domestic life brought both joy and fragility. Saskia appeared in several of his works, radiant, adorned, alive with warmth. Yet family life in the 17th century was shadowed by illness and loss, realities that touched nearly every household. Stability, though visible on the surface, rested on uncertain ground. In this period, Rembrandt stood at a peak, respected, prosperous, confident in his vision. But prosperity carried its own weight. Financial obligations, changing markets, and the delicate balance between artistic independence and economic reality. Light still shone brightly on his world. Shadows, however, had already begun to lengthen, quietly, almost invisibly, at the edges of success. Chapter 7. Love, Loss, and the Deepening of Shadow. Behind the prosperity of Rembrandt's Amsterdam years, another story unfolded. One not measured in commissions or houses, but in fragile breaths and quiet grief. Rembrandt and Saskia's marriage began with promise, warmth, and companionship. She appears in his paintings not as a distant symbol, but as someone known intimately, laughing, adorned, present in shared life. Yet the 17th century offered no guarantees against loss, and their household soon felt the vulnerability common to the era. One child was born, then gone. Another followed, and again, the small life did not remain. A third infant died soon after birth. These were not dramatic public tragedies, but private devastations, endured behind closed doors. In a time before modern medicine, such losses were frequent, yet frequency does not soften grief. Each absence leaves a different silence. In 1641, a son survived, Titus. His survival must have brought relief mingled with fear, the awareness that life was both miracle and uncertainty. Around him, the household carried memory of those who had not stayed. Saskia's health, however, had long been fragile. Illness moved slowly, but steadily. By 1642, as Rembrandt was completing one of the most ambitious commissions of his career, her strength was fading. She died in June of that year. Rembrandt, still in his 30s, lost not only a wife, but a companion, social bridge, and emotional center. The house he had filled with objects and art held a different atmosphere afterward. Rooms larger, quieter. Outwardly, this was a period of artistic prominence. Inwardly, it marked a narrowing of personal life. It is tempting to draw direct lines between tragedy and style, yet history rarely allows such certainty. What can be observed is that in the years that followed, his attention to human presence grew more inward, more concentrated. Faces carry weight not through drama, but through stillness. Loss alters perception. The world does not lose its light,
but light feels temporary, fragile, slipping away even as one watches. Rembrandt had always been attentive to shadow. Now, shadow existed not only on canvas, but in memory. After Saskia's death, domestic stability shifted again. Care for Titus required help. Relationships formed within the household that would later bring legal and social complications. But before conflict, there was simply adjustment. A widower continuing to work, to parent, to live among reminders of what had vanished. Grief did not erupt into spectacle. It settled like evening, gradual and persistent. And in the quiet of studio light, falling across aging faces and thoughtful eyes, Rembrandt continued to paint, not to escape sorrow, but to look steadily at the human condition that includes it. His art did not grow darker in despair. It grew deeper in recognition.
Chapter 8. When Light Broke the Rules. In 1642, Rembrandt completed a painting that would stand at the center of his career, not only as achievement, but as turning point. Officially titled The Militia Company of Captain Frans Banning Kok, it would later become known as the Night Watch, a name given in later centuries after darkened varnish made the scene appear nocturnal. Commissioned as a group portrait for Amsterdam's Civic Guard, the work was meant to join a hall filled with similar paintings, orderly arrangements of men posed to affirm unity, rank, and civic pride. Rembrandt did something else. Instead of a static assembly, he created motion. Captain Kok steps forward, dressed in black with a vivid red sash, his hand extended in command. Beside him, Lieutenant Willem van Rotenburg glows in pale gold. Around them, figures shift, load muskets, turn their heads, prepare to move. A drummer beats. A dog darts. And among the soldiers appears a young girl, bathed in luminous light, carrying a chicken whose claws reference the militia's emblem. She is not a standard portrait participant, but a symbolic figure woven into the action. Light does not fall evenly. It strikes selectively. Some faces blaze into clarity, others dissolve into shadow. Depth replaces flat order. Atmosphere replaces symmetry. The painting feels less like a record and more like a moment unfolding, the seconds before movement. For Rembrandt, this was synthesis. Dramatic illumination, psychological individuality, and narrative tension converged. He treated a civic portrait as living history, elevating local citizens into participants in an unfolding drama. Such innovation did not perfectly align with established expectations. Members of the militia had contributed financially to be represented, and Rembrandt's dynamic composition gave unequal visibility, an artistic choice that may not have satisfied every participant, though no formal rejection is recorded. The work marked a subtle shift. His artistic priorities were moving beyond convention. Artistically, the breakthrough was unmistakable. Here, light ceased to describe reality and began to interpret it. Illumination became emotion, hierarchy, narrative force. Darkness became active space rather than absence. The Night Watch stands as a declaration. Painting need not mirror order. It can embody life's unpredictability. In that boldness lay both brilliance and risk. Rembrandt had followed his understanding of truth, that human existence is movement emerging from shadow. In doing so, he stepped fully into his mature voice, even as the path ahead
grew less certain.
Chapter 9. The Cost of Difference. After the night watch, Rembrandt remained known, but the nature of his recognition began to shift. He was respected, certainly, yet the steady stream of high-profile group commissions slowed. Amsterdam's taste did not reject him outright, but it began leaning toward smoother finishes, brighter palettes, more predictable arrangements. His dramatic asymmetry and heavy shadow were no longer the unquestioned preference. At the same time, his personal life grew complicated. Following Saskia's death, a woman named Geertje Dirks entered his household as nursemaid to Titus. Their relationship moved beyond employment, and what followed became one of the more painful episodes of his private life. Legal disputes emerged when the relationship deteriorated. Accusations, financial settlements, and eventual confinement of Geertje to a correctional institution left marks, not only socially, but financially. Records show legal entanglements that drained resources and strained reputation. Later, Hendrikje Stoffels joined his household. She became his companion and bore him a daughter, Cornelia. Unlike his marriage to Saskia, this relationship existed outside formal bounds. The Dutch Reformed Church took notice. Hendrikje was summoned before the church council and censured for living in sin. Though Rembrandt himself avoided formal punishment, the scrutiny was public. In a society that valued moral discipline, deviation invited quiet exclusion. During these years, his art turned increasingly inward. Biblical scenes grew more intimate, less theatrical and more contemplative. Figures seemed absorbed in thought rather than caught in spectacle. His self-portraits, too, evolved. The confident young man adorned in finery gave way to a face more searching, more lined, more exposed. Isolation did not mean obscurity. Students still came. Collectors still purchased. But something had shifted. He was no longer simply the celebrated innovator of Amsterdam's rising merchant class. He had become a singular presence, admired, debated, sometimes misunderstood. Financial pressures compounded the emotional strain. The large house purchased in prosperous years demanded payments that grew heavier as commissions fluctuated. Collecting habits continued. Debt accumulated gradually, then visibly. Recognition can be double-edged. It elevates, but it also isolates. As Rembrandt's style grew more personal and less aligned with prevailing fashion, he stood further apart from his contemporaries. Yet he did not soften his approach to regain comfort. He painted as he saw, faces marked by time, bodies shaped by experience, light falling unevenly across human vulnerability. If the distance between him and society widened, so too did the depth within his work. He seemed willing to accept solitude if it preserved truth. In that acceptance, isolation became both burden and integrity.
Chapter 10. Fame in the light, turmoil in the shadows. By the 1650s, Rembrandt's life had divided into two distinct realities. Outwardly, he remained a known name, an established master with a body of respected work, former students who carried his influence, and paintings circulating among collectors. Inwardly, strain gathered with increasing weight. The large house on the Breestraat, once a symbol of success, had become a burden. Mortgage payments, legal obligations, and years of ambitious collecting placed pressure on his finances. Unlike court artists supported by monarchs, Rembrandt worked within a market system where income depended on commissions, sales, and shifting taste.
What had been manageable risk during prosperous years grew more difficult as circumstances changed, a vulnerability familiar to many independent artists in the Dutch Republic. In 1656, the imbalance could no longer be sustained. Rembrandt entered a legal process of insolvency before the Amsterdam authorities. An inventory of his possessions was taken, a document that reads like a map of his mind. Paintings by other masters, prints, armor, fabrics, shells, sculptures, curiosities from distant cultures. These were not random luxuries. They were fragments of visual knowledge, textures and histories he drew upon in his work. Yet to creditors, they were assets to be assessed and sold. The auctions that followed dispersed his collection and eventually his house. Rooms once filled with study and creation passed to others. For an artist who had built a working environment from objects of observation and imagination, the loss reshaped daily life as much as finances. Insolvency in the 17th century Dutch context did not mean destitution in the modern sense, but it did mark the loss of property, social standing, and financial independence. Rembrandt continued to work, supported in part by Hendrikje and Titus, who helped structure practical arrangements that allowed the studio to function despite legal restrictions. Something paradoxical occurred. As outer security diminished, his art did not retreat. It deepened in quiet intensity. Portraits from these years carry fewer adornments, less display. Faces emerge from shadow with greater stillness, as if stripped of distraction. The drama became internal rather than theatrical. The contrast between reputation and reality grew sharper. Viewers still encountered powerful images bearing his name, often unaware of the practical economies behind their creation. Publicly, he remained associated with mastery. Privately, he navigated narrower means and altered circumstances. This was not a fall into silence, but a passage into concentration. When material structures shifted, the territory fully his remained perception itself, the ability to look at a human face and find, within light and shadow, the full weight of existence. In losing the outer world he had assembled, Rembrandt turned more completely toward the inner one he could never forfeit. Chapter 11. The Slow Quieting of Strength. Time does not announce its turning points. It gathers quietly, year by year, until the body begins to move differently and effort requires more intention than before. By the late 1650s, Rembrandt was entering such a phase. He was in his 50s, not elderly by modern measure, but well into the later span of a 17th century life marked by strain, loss, and labor. The studio remained active, yet its rhythm changed. Where earlier decades carried the urgency of ambition and rising demand, now work proceeded with steadier, more deliberate pace. Large, elaborate commissions were rarer. Portraits and biblical scenes continued, but the atmosphere around them felt more inward, less driven by external expectation. Aging brought physical reality. Eyesight subtly shifting, hands that had ground pigments and guided brushes for decades, now bearing the quiet fatigue of repetition. There is no dramatic record of illness overtaking him, yet the evidence lies in the paintings themselves. Broader strokes, thicker paint, a willingness to let surfaces remain unresolved. What might once have been refined to polish was now left expressive, immediate. Students still passed through his orbit, though fewer than in earlier years. The bustling workshop culture that had once surrounded him thinned.
Some former pupils had established independent careers, carrying fragments of his approach into the wider art world. Rembrandt remained central, but less crowded. Emotionally, endurance replaced striving. He had already known prosperity and humiliation, companionship and loss. The sharp peaks and plunges of earlier life settled into a quieter persistence. There is a particular fatigue that follows long resilience. Not despair, but the heaviness of having endured much. Yet the fading of physical energy did not dim perception. If anything, his attention grew more focused. Late faces in his paintings hold a stillness that feels patient, accepting. He no longer chased spectacle. He waited for presence to emerge. Light, too, changed in these works. It softened. Highlights glow rather than blaze. Shadows feel less theatrical, more enveloping, like evening light rather than noon. The force that once pushed outward into recognition now turned inward into contemplation. Strength did not vanish. It transformed from drive into depth. Rembrandt continued to work not as a man racing time, but as one aware of its weight, moving more slowly, perhaps, but seeing with a clarity earned only through years lived fully in both light and shadow.
Chapter 12. An Art World Moving On.
While Rembrandt's pace quieted, the wider art world did not stand still. Taste, like commerce, shifts with generations. By the mid-17th century, Dutch painting increasingly favored clarity, elegance, and refined surfaces. Light grew cooler, spaces more orderly, figures more polished. Scenes of domestic calm, bright interiors, and meticulously described textures appealed to buyers who valued balance and precision. In comparison, Rembrandt's work appeared heavier, darker, less concerned with surface perfection. His thick paint, broad handling, and emotional gravity ran against the direction of fashion. Where others offered clarity, he offered depth. Where others illuminated rooms, he illuminated souls. New names gained prominence. Younger artists captured the market with brightness and compositional harmony. Their works suited well-lit homes and the growing desire for art that affirmed comfort rather than questioned it. Rembrandt's intensity, once admired as bold innovation, now seemed to some like excess, a style tied to an earlier moment. This shift was not a public rejection, but a gradual repositioning. He did not disappear, yet he stood less at the center of taste. Collectors seeking contemporary elegance might pass his works in favor of lighter alternatives. In an economy driven by preference, such movement carried real consequence. Still, Rembrandt did not recalibrate to follow fashion. There is no sign he attempted to thin his paint, brighten his palette, or smooth his textures to match new trends. His late work suggests the opposite, increasing confidence in personal vision, even as it diverged further from the mainstream. The result was a quiet separation. The art world expanded around him, while he moved along a path that had become distinctly his own. He painted not for the moment's approval, but from accumulated understanding, of faces, of suffering, of resilience. In the broader current of Dutch art, the river flowed toward light-filled domestic order. Rembrandt stood at a bend where waters deepened and darkened. Fewer boats passed that way, but the depth remained. Art history often remembers revolutions. Daily life records preferences. In these years, preference drifted elsewhere. Rembrandt continued, steady and unaltered,
as the world's eye turned gradually toward different kinds of light.
Chapter 13. The Last Conversations with Light. In the final decade of his life, Rembrandt's paintings grew quieter, but also more profound. The surfaces thickened. Brushstrokes remained visible, unapologetic. Light no longer flashed with theatrical force. It seemed to breathe softly across faces, as though aware of its own fragility. His late self-portraits stand among the most searching images ever created by an artist of himself. The youthful bravado of earlier years had long disappeared. In its place stood a man marked by time, sagging skin, tired eyes, flesh no longer firm. Yet there is no self-pity in these works. The gaze is steady, direct, almost assessing. He does not disguise age, he studies it. Paint gathers heavily around the forehead and cheeks, catching light unevenly. The background recedes into dark simplicity. Clothing becomes less ornate. What remains central is presence. The fact of a human being still looking outward, still aware. In biblical scenes from this period, spectacle diminishes. The compositions are intimate, often focused on a small group or even two figures. Gestures are restrained. Emotional exchange occurs in quiet glances rather than dramatic movement. The sacred becomes personal. Divine narratives feel grounded in human tenderness and doubt. There is also an increasing softness in the way figures meet light. Highlights glow gently rather than blaze sharply. The contrast between illumination and shadow feels less confrontational and more reconciled. Darkness no longer threatens. It surrounds like evening air. Materially, the paint itself seems to carry weight. Thick impasto catches light physically, creating texture that invites the eye to linger. It is as though Rembrandt allowed the act of painting, the physical contact between brush and surface, to remain visible, refusing illusionistic smoothness. These late works do not attempt to compete with contemporary fashion. They do not brighten to match prevailing taste. Instead, they settle into honesty. Age is neither beautified nor condemned. It is observed. If earlier decades revealed ambition and drama, these final years reveal acceptance. The conversation between light and shadow becomes less about contrast and more about coexistence. In these paintings, Rembrandt seems less concerned with how he is seen and more attentive to what he sees. And what he sees is humanity, worn, resilient, illuminated gently against the inevitability of time.
Chapter 14. Rooms growing quieter.
By the 1660s, the circle around Rembrandt had grown small. The lively household of earlier years, filled with students, models, objects, and voices, had thinned into something more fragile. Hendrikje Stoffels, his companion through years of difficulty, died in 1663. She had been more than emotional support. She helped manage practical matters, forming part of the arrangement that allowed Rembrandt to continue working despite financial constraints. Her absence left a practical void, as well as a personal one. The home, already quieter than in past decades, lost another source of warmth. Only Titus remained, the son who had survived childhood when others had not. As he grew into adulthood, Titus stepped into responsibility, assisting with the business structure that protected his father's ability to paint. The bond between them appears to have been steady, shaped by shared endurance. But life in this period was uncertain, and security never settled firmly. Rembrandt's world contracted not through dramatic retreat, but through gradual narrowing. Fewer social gatherings, fewer students, fewer public roles. His presence in Amsterdam's civic life, once notable, faded into the background. He moved through the city as a known figure, but no longer a central one. Inside the studio, work continued. Light still entered through windows, faces still emerged from shadow. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the act of painting carried the stillness of late afternoon rather than morning energy. In 1668, Titus died, leaving Rembrandt to face a loss that reached deeper than public decline or financial hardship. A parent outliving a child encounters a silence that reshapes the world. After so many earlier losses, children in infancy, Saskia, Hendrikje, this final absence weighed heavily. There is no record of dramatic gestures, no written lament. Only the paintings remain, steady and searching. The rooms had grown quieter, but not empty. Rembrandt continued to work within them, accompanied now more by memory than by voices. Life had narrowed to essentials: light, shadow, and the human face, still worthy of attention, even in solitude.
Chapter 15. The Light That Remained. In the autumn of 1669, Rembrandt van Rijn's life came to its close in Amsterdam. He was 63 years old, a span shaped by ambition, devotion to art, love, loss, and the long negotiation between independence and circumstance. There is no grand final scene recorded, no dramatic farewell. His last years had already quieted into a modest rhythm. The bustling studio of earlier decades had thinned. The house was smaller than the one he had once filled with objects and students. Many of those closest to him had gone before: Saskia, Hendrikje, Titus. The city around him continued its trade, its noise, its progress, largely unaware that one of its most searching observers was nearing the end of his days. Yet work had continued almost to the end. His final paintings carry no sense of abandonment, no sign that he turned away from looking. Faces remain present, light still touching brow and cheek, shadow still holding its patient depth. The dialogue between illumination and darkness, begun in youth, refined through decades, never ceased. When he died, he did not leave wealth or public ceremony. Records show he was buried in Amsterdam's Westerkerk in a rented grave, a common arrangement that did not preserve a marked resting place. His body returned quietly to the city whose faces he had studied so closely. What remained in that moment was not status, not property, not acclaim. It was simply the fact of a life lived in attention, to human expression, to the fragile balance between light and obscurity, to the dignity that persists even in decline. In the end, Rembrandt was not surrounded by spectacle, but by the same elements that had defined his art from the beginning: a room, a source of light, and the presence of shadow. The man who had spent a lifetime revealing others through illumination passed into darkness himself, leaving behind the silence that follows a candle gently going out. Epilogue. Where the light still falls. After his death, the world did not immediately recognize the full measure of Rembrandt's achievement. Tastes had shifted during his lifetime, and for a time his heavier style stood outside fashion. Yet art does not move only with trends. It moves with rediscovery.
In later centuries, painters and viewers returned to his canvases and found something enduring, a way of seeing that reached beneath surface appearance. Artists such as Goya, Turner, and Van Gogh would later explore light not just as illumination, but as emotion, a lineage that traces back to Rembrandt's insistence that shadow carries meaning. His portraits helped redefine what a likeness could be, not merely a record of features, but an encounter with inner life. Psychological depth, textured paint, selective light. These became tools for future generations seeking honesty over ornament. Today, his works stand in major museums, with the Night Watch at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, drawing viewers who fall silent before its shifting glow. Conservation teams study its layers. Scholars examine his brushwork, his materials, his revisions. Yet beyond technical study, the emotional experience remains immediate. Faces painted centuries ago still feel present, still aware. Rembrandt has become a symbol not of uninterrupted success, but of artistic integrity, of a life in which vision persisted through changing fortune. His art reminds modern viewers that light is most powerful when it emerges from darkness, and that human dignity often resides in vulnerability rather than display. In galleries across the world, visitors stand before his paintings much as we began tonight, in quiet rooms, watching light touch a face from long ago. If this journey into the life behind the shadows moved you, stay with us for more calm explorations of history's most human stories, and share which figure you would like to walk beside next